to Jonathan. So, Jonathan, I'm going to make you the host.
Okay.
Which I'm doing now. So, over to you, sir.
Right, thank you. So I have control of the aeroplane.
That's it.
Probably a very bad idea, but never mind. Okay, let's see if we can.
That's it.
Hold on. Right, you should be seeing the first slide and what have you.
Yep.
Good.
And we can see the first slide. Yeah.
Very good. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for sparing the time this evening. What I want to do is look at some, obviously this is a conflict that has been massively in the news and sadly is going to continue to be in the news for some months yet. A lot of what we see in the news to some extent is rather misleading, I think, and suggests novelty sometimes when there is much less novelty than perhaps might meet the eye. So what I want to do today is make a kind of provisional or interim judgment. Lessons from the war is perhaps a little bit portentous. It's maybe more a series of observations and assessments from the first months of the war that we've seen so far. Now, of course, it's crucial. Every war has a specific context that relates the forces that are opposed, the terrain, the nature of the military technology at the time. And as I say, a lot of the reporting has been focused very much on particular weapon systems, whether it be unmanned aerial vehicles, kamikaze drones, as some people in the media call these things. The demise of the tank, loads of pictures of Russian tanks with their turrets blown off and so on. The tank is dead, we're told. The place of manned aircraft has been taken by the drones. And I think all of this is deeply misleading, and the reality, as ever, is much more complex. There are things that are novel about the war, but they tend to be things about the employment of things or the combination of the employment of weapon systems. And just an example, which we'll touch on later, the combined use of ballistic missiles and, of anti-shipping missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, which played the role in the sinking of the Russian Black Sea flagship, the Moskva. And I suppose, to be fair to people, one of the reasons why so much appears to be new is that this is the first major war between, if you like, major industrial players, certainly in Europe since 1945, and really the first war between two countries with the scale of forces and the range of weaponry that Ukraine and Russia can bring to bear. We in the West are very used to a very different kind of war, a war far from home, Iraq, Afghanistan, one that, whilst its counterinsurgency phases may last for years, the actual hard, immediate fighting is relatively quick. There are huge imbalances in the quality and the scale of forces involved. A victory, in a sense, in a narrow military sense, comes very quickly. And there are, of course, wars where the wider population, where our economies usually, and so on, are really insulated from any of the ill effects. Now, I'm very conscious, having worked for the World Service for so many years, that if you were talking to an Iraqi or an Afghan or whatever, they would have a completely different view of these things. So this is very much from a Western perspective, but it's what's shaped our understanding of what modern conflict is about. And of course, the war in Ukraine is challenging many of those assumptions. So let's look at a few of the key lessons and so on. But there are two big themes I want you to have in your mind as we go through this. One of these themes is the information context. And we've talked a lot. I did an earlier talk for James about the media handling of the conflict. And you saw there, and I'll repeat some of them, some of the extraordinary sources that we have now to monitor and watch what is going on almost in real time. But of course, that information environment has huge implications for the way the war is sold to the rest of the world, the battle for hearts and minds around the world, which of course for Ukraine is absolutely crucial. It also has, as we'll see, huge implications for the actual conduct and the fighting of the battle at the tactical level on the ground. Now, if we look just at the sort of geopolitics of it, Ukraine is clearly a vast landmass, surrounded almost in a kind of like a D shape by Belarus to the north, and then Russia all the way around. And of course, Russia, for all the problems it's been having, the absolutely dominant naval player here in the Black Sea. So it is completely ringed almost, except for this western border, which luckily for Ukraine is obviously a border with NATO countries. And although there have been air attacks and so on in cities in the west and so on, so far the Russians have not done very much to try to interrupt Western arms flows. They've not been able to do very much to alter the free movement of personnel back and forth across this border. Obviously, many thousands of Ukrainians coming abroad as refugees, several thousands coming for military training in the West, here in Britain, very successfully, in a new program soon to get underway in the European Union, I think in Germany and in Poland. And these sympathetic allies have been crucial as a sanctuary, as I say, for refugees, as a place which gives Ukraine additional strategic depth. Even some of the higher grade repair work on Ukrainian equipment is probably being done in some of the NATO countries close to its border. And of course, crucially, in an absolute sort of military textbook sense, because of the strategic geography, Ukraine has internal lines of communication, and Russia has very, very long external lines of communication. Now, obviously, the good thing for Russia is that it's got a very well-developed rail system, and it's particularly attuned its rail systems to its military and strategic needs. And we've seen an awful lot of rail used in this conflict. Just to get a sense of the scale of all of this, I mean, this is the front line if it was stretched out in a single line. We are talking about vast distances, and even the very large military formations that are deployed in this war, they're tiny parcels of forces compared to the kind of units that were fighting over this same terrain during the Second World War with the Nazis and Russia. Remember too that the war hasn't just started now. For Ukraine, it's been going on for some considerable time. Huge disparities, as you see there in that comment, in terms of population and so on. But that period of the war, since in the East, since 2014, has been very important for Ukraine. It's not only honed many of the military formations that were able to play a very significant role in the early defense of the country in the wake of Russia's invasion, but it also prompted an awful lot of training relationships with the West. Ukraine's special forces were largely trained by their Western equivalents and so on. And that set up a pattern and a set of relationships that I think were very important going forward into the conflict itself. Now, I talk about a transparent battlefield. I mean, clearly one shouldn't overstate this. We're not watching this on closed circuit television, blow by blow. But nonetheless, the advent of the mobile phone, an extraordinary means of gathering video, still pictures, sound, of transmitting it and so on, is crucial. And then you have the whole panoply of the social media, YouTube, Messenger, Telegram, Twitter, Facebook, the whole lot. And that has enabled us to be able to watch key events unfolding, and certainly also to get a picture of what the conflict looks like to some extent. Now, clearly, it's a particularly carefully chosen picture. We see the things that people want to put out, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of what the terrain looks like. It gives you a sense of what the combat looks like, and so on. And of course, crucially, all of these things have provided vital intelligence, both intelligence in a military sense. You have Ukrainians using mobile phones and plugging into a network to basically provide targeting information for their own forces from occupied areas and so on. But you also have clearly the ability of people outside to get a real sense of what is going on. And that, of course, was crucial in the run-up to the war. Remember, we arrived at this stage with, let's be honest, a Western intelligence system which was not hugely successful in the past. The Iraq War had cast a great shadow. People were skeptical about what was going on. And because of all this freely available so-called open source information, you didn't have to wait until the Americans, for example, declassified a particular satellite image. You could see things as they were actually happening. This is a CIT, it's actually surprisingly a Russian open source organization. They and individuals and so on were posting pictures of the buildup of the Russian forces around Ukraine's borders. That's a little after the opening of the war. But again, you can buy satellite photos. They're not that expensive. Organizations can do this, media groups can do this, and so on. And this is the kind of granularity you get from a civilian satellite. It's quite extraordinary. You can see the aircraft types, you can count them, and so on and so forth. And because of all this information flooding around so openly, before the war, the Ministry of Defence, who has been putting out a daily sort of intelligence update, which is a kind of, there are political lines in it, but it is nonetheless a very useful intelligence assessment. They were able to put out this picture before the war of what they believed the Russians would do. And surprise, surprise, the Belarus president, the equivalent of the people filming the files as ministers walk into Downing Street and reading off what they were going to do. Well, this was the Belarus president speaking before the war, presumably with a map that he got from the Russians, explaining to people what they were going to do. So there was no great surprise. Amateur enthusiasts have been able to, this is a guy who puts out regular little maps like this. He's a huge partisan of the Ukrainians. I wouldn't necessarily always accept everything he says, but the maps themselves are very useful, updated regularly. This is what this information environment allows. There are some strange and interesting sources of information. This comes from NASA's FIRMS detection system. I can't remember what FIRM stands for, but this is essentially a NASA kind of environmental satellite system that monitors fires, outbreaks of fire in the world. I mean, you can imagine in the terrible wildfires we've seen in Australia and elsewhere. It's an extremely useful tool. Well, surprise, surprise, of course, battlefields involve an awful amount of fire as well. And that has been a useful tool to be able to monitor what's going on. The ability to monitor, certainly at least in free airspace, international flights has been hugely useful. And this is just on a particular day or particular few days, the tracks of Swedish and NATO intelligence gathering aircraft around Belarus and Ukraine, hoovering up signals intelligence, data of all kinds, voice transmissions, and what have you. And just if you want to follow a particular aircraft and you're an enthusiast for these things, well, there you are. Somebody was following this particular Royal Air Force RC-135 Rivet Joint, which is a signals intelligence gathering aircraft about the size of a Boeing 707 or something, as it was tootling around off the coast of Crimea. In the news today, you heard the sentences given to, in absentia, sadly, given to the people who are believed to have been behind the shooting down of the MH17 airliner. Bellingcat, the organization that did an extraordinary job in identifying forensically who those individuals were, did another very interesting piece of work a week, 10 days or so ago, which looked at who were the targeteers, who were the people who were setting out the targets, all these electricity power stations and what have you in Ukraine that were being hit by the Russians. And it's this group of people here. I mean, they look nice enough, but I suppose you could say they're doing their job. But, Bellingcat probably have phone records from them. They probably have their names and addresses and so on and so forth. And this is all stuff that is open source available if you know where to go and get it, or you're prepared to pay for it. As I think Bellingcat do pay for some stuff that they get from places like Russia. So it's an extraordinary world of information. Now, of course, the problem is that that's all very well, but you've got to make your assessment. And one of the great difficulties is, whilst we were able to monitor the Russian build-up very carefully, we knew very little about what Ukraine was going to do. Ukraine was very reticent. Ukraine, remember, was being warned all the time, good Lord, you know, an invasion is imminent. And they would say, well, don't worry, we don't need to go onto a war footing yet, and so on. And there are many reasons for that. And in part also, I think there was a reticence in dealing with the Americans, because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, was known, I think, to be rather skeptical as to how Ukraine would fare in this conflict. And I'm afraid that was a view that really extended across Western intelligence organizations. This quote here from the former Prime Minister shows you that this was very much the view that even though people had given token help to Ukraine and so on and so forth, if push came to shove, the Russians would simply roll through. And of course, the Russians didn't simply roll through. Incidentally, David Richards, who was on the radio pontificating yesterday, I remember him early before the war saying the Ukrainians should just give in because there was nothing they could do, which raises interesting questions as to whether you really want somebody like that at the helm of your armed forces, but we will leave that to one side. So, on the eve of the war, remarkable degree of visibility of what the Russians are doing, an erroneous picture of the Russian capabilities. I'll come to that in a moment. Very little understanding of what Ukraine might be able to do. Now, we greatly overestimated the Russians. The idea was, in the circles that follow these things, that whilst Western countries were engaged in faraway counterinsurgency operations, whilst their military forces were losing many of the skills of high-intensity warfare, the Russians were modernizing, were improving, were incorporating electronic warfare and a whole range of other key systems for high-intensity combat into their forces down to ever lower levels. There were new equipment was being bought, and one of the sort of poster children of this new Russian military rearmament was this fellow here, the Armata tank, the T-14, which was first revealed in May 2015 at one of the Moscow Victory Day parades. I think we've seen 7 or 8 of these, 2017, 2018. They may have, dozen, 20 prototypes, but for a whole variety of reasons, they were never able to put this into production. It was to have been in service by 2020. Well, it very much isn't. What's interesting, it's got a crew of 3, like most Russian tanks, but it's got nobody in the turret. The crew are all down inside the vehicle. But this was a kind of a symbol of the modernization of Russian forces that was underway. And on the eve of the war, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, was talking about a far more capable Russian military. Previous attempts at reform had not worked, but now things were moving to some extent. And if you look through Russia's performance in Georgia, not great, certainly into eastern Ukraine, where it did quite well in its sort of semi-open warfare there against the Ukrainians, and particularly Syria. And Syria, I think, particularly because it contrasts very much with the terrible mess that Western countries got themselves into in the Middle East. Yes, the Russians did quite well in Syria. If you're prepared to be as brutal as they were and so on, they achieved their goals with relatively limited casualties amongst their own forces and relatively small forces involved as well. This is a train that the Russians sent around the country, basically a mobile display of bits of equipment captured in Syria, talking about the prowess of the Russian military. And again, the IISS speaking about the Syria and these other interventions, a sense that, Syria had been a great proving ground for the Russian military. The problem is this is the reality in Ukraine. This is crossing the it's crossing the Sversky Donets River in the east near Biroivka back in early May. There was a very brutal contested river crossing and the Russians came off very badly indeed. Now, the Russians have performed appallingly in many ways. from their initial plans to their execution, to their logistics, to their command, to the war crimes, their inability to secure control of the air, the overall execution of their operations has been lamentable. And so, again, I think we have to be cautious, because if we're going to draw lessons from all of this, well, before the war, we kind of thought the Russians were much more capable than they were. I don't think we should necessarily run away from this conflict believing that the Russians are just totally hopeless and are a complete mess. I think when we get a much more granular in time, a much more detailed understanding of what the Russians set about, how they set about it, and why, we will be able to see that to some extent Russia's performance has been very mixed, but it's been hobbled by the nature of the operation that they embarked upon, and really by the futility of what they were trying to do. Rather nicely, Radek Sikorski, the Polish politician and commentator, came up with this rather nice turn of phrase, which I thought was quite true. Putin's army turns out to have been a 20th century army with 19th century logistics. And of course, logistics is one of the words that the media has discovered in the wake of this war. I'm sure to an audience like this one, that is clearly of no surprise. But, you know, logistics are key. This is part of that long Russian convoy that was stranded on the road from the border towards Kyiv at the early part of the war. And of course, much of the Russian failure early on really stems from its inability to get its logistics convoys to where they were needed, particularly for an armor-heavy force, which needs lots of logistics and lots of things of various kinds. Poor planning, poor preparation, and so on. So, as in so many wars, not a new lesson, but logistics is really what wins wars. Now let's look at a few of the weapon systems involved. The tank, I mean, this is a kind of typical photo that we've seen, a Russian tank incinerated with its turret blown off. And of course, one of the great, great weapons of the early stage of this war were the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, the Javelin, the American Javelin, and this is the British Scandinavian NLAWs. Fascinating weapons, carry a very big punch. They have the capacity to both engage the target directly or fly slightly over it and, hit it from above where the armor is weaker. Hence the fact that so many Russian tanks that we've seen have had these improvised cages over the top to try and protect against these downward attacks. This, interestingly, as well, is a T-62, a tank really at fault in the 1973 war in the Middle East. These are the sorts of things the Russians are having to pull out from storage because they have lost so many tanks, possibly 1,400 or so far. We're obviously not sure. And the reason for the weakness of the Russian tanks and for all these blown off turrets, it's because Russian tank design went in a completely different direction to that of the West after the Second World War. The Russians went for lighter, faster, smaller, lower profile tanks. And to do that, they removed one member of the crew, the loader for the main gun. And instead, they placed a kind of rotary carousel, an automatic loading system that inconveniently sits just below the crew at the bottom underneath the turret. And so you can imagine if the turret is penetrated, particularly from the top, the results are catastrophic. As you can see there in that rather nice little diagram, Western tanks keep the ammunition in relatively secure lockers away from the crew as far as is possible. Now the tank. Oh God, hang on, what have I done now? That's the traditional view of the tank, ideal combination of firepower, mobility, and survivability, which dominates the close land battle. And what you've had is an awful lot of people, even in some military circles, saying, well, this is no longer the case. This is a very interesting guy I know, who's a former US Marine colonel, who's now at the National Defense University in the States. And as he's saying, you know, as it were, the opportunity costs, so they're the heavier tanks to protect their crews as they lumber around. Is it really worth having this with its long logistical tail and so on? And we should remember that the US Marine Corps, which is a kind of mini armed forces in itself, at the moment under a new plan for US Marine Corps 2030, it's called, has just got rid of all of its tanks. You know, it's focusing now on fighting a distributed operation in the Pacific against China. It's decided that a lot of these heavy systems are just simply not worth having. Now, it may well be that in Europe, in a continental land battle, the tank still has a utility. This is the guy who's in charge at the Pentagon of planning for America's next battle tank. And I think he makes a very fair point. Tanks are, so of course, they're vulnerable, but everything else is very vulnerable. And most vulnerable are individual soldiers without any armor protection. And this is, you know, part and parcel of the age-old battle in military history between offense and defense. And indeed, the impact of the anti-tank missiles on the Russian forces in the early days of the war, you know, it's not new. If you think back to the 1973 war, when the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal and the Israelis happily charged with their tanks across the Sinai Desert to push the Egyptians into the canal, and they were met by, for that generation, wire-guided Soviet anti-tank missiles, Saga anti-tank missiles mainly, and they lost huge numbers of tanks. Then, as now, there were those who said, my goodness me, the tank is dead. Well, you found ways around this. And of course, one of the most important ways around this is to fight a combined arms battle. You know, for the layperson, you have the whole orchestra. And the instruments in the orchestra may change. You know, new technology may give you new weapon systems, but fundamentally, it's not individual weapon systems that win wars. It's how you put the whole thing together. And the crucial thing for tanks is to have infantry protection. And the Russian military, sadly for them, in the way they deployed their forces, did not have sufficient infantry. Many of the infantry units are undermanned in the Russian military at the moment. There are certainly many of them not highly trained, and they've had real problems in giving our heavy armor that essential infantry support dimension that goes some way to negating the kind of anti-tank missile that we've seen before. That's just, you know, what some people are thinking the future main battle tank will need. It'll be a hybrid, it'll have electric power, all sorts of new sensors, onboard drones for surveillance, and of course, anti-drone defense. And we'll come to drones again in a minute. Another lesson to be drawn from the war, and certainly its early stages, is that what's very risky has now become much riskier. This is a Russian BMP 3 or 4, not entirely sure, but essentially it's a paratroop armored vehicle. Russia is one of the few countries in the world whose paratroop forces have their own dedicated armored vehicles, specially designed for the task. India, I think, deploys the same thing because they bought them from the Russians. But basically, Hostomel Airport, northwest of Kyiv, the Russians decided that their airborne forces would land there by helicopter, seize the airfield, troops would be flown in, and that would be an air bridge that would then enable them to get much closer to the Ukrainian capital. As things turned out, it was a complete mess. Initially, they seized the airport. There's a famous Matthew Chancellor, colleague of mine at the BBC who works for CNN. He fetched up at the airport and found all these Russian paratroopers there and filmed it all. It was quite a coup for him. They were then kicked out of the airfield by the Ukrainians. The Russians eventually came back and seized it, but the whole place was a complete mess. And meanwhile, Russian airborne forces, who spearheaded a lot of the attacks into Ukraine, certainly against the capital, were chewed up pretty seriously. This is a few of them at Hostomel. Helicopters have been very vulnerable. The British ministry, there's a K-25 attack helicopter, sort of equivalent of a Cobra or something like that. The British Ministry of Defence reckons the Russians have lost about a quarter of their whole inventory of these so far in the war. They've proved very, very vulnerable. They've had to be used because fixed-wing air power has not been able to carry out the sorts of missions the Russians would have wanted, because they didn't destroy all of Ukraine's air defenses. There have been ammunition shortages on the artillery side. So these rotary wing aircraft have been called in to do missions which are very, very risky, and they've lost an awful lot of them in the process. So I think there's real questions now about whether the survivability of these things in a future battlefield. And that's in part because another airborne system, the unmanned aerial vehicle, has become so ubiquitous that countries are now waking up to the fact that they need to radically improve their ground-based air defenses. This is another one of the early stars of the war, the Bayraktar, a Turkish drone. Simple, but relatively sophisticated. Again, this was hailed early on. It got its own Ukrainian song because it was doing such marvelous work in the early days of the war. Again, it wasn't new. If you go back to the war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2021, Armenia lost huge numbers of tanks, which were destroyed by these Turkish-supplied drones supplied to Azerbaijan. Paradoxically, of course, they destroyed huge quantities of Armenian tanks. The Armenians weren't able to use the tanks on the ground and suffered very badly at the hands of the Azeri ground forces, which again kind of doesn't tell you that the tank is obsolete. It means that you need to keep your tanks protected and to have a combined system that allows the tanks in some way or another to survive. The Bayraktar did well early on. Possibly one reason it did well early on is that the Russians were very reluctant to use their air defenses. They were very afraid of shooting down their own systems in the first few days of the war. And so perhaps these things had a certain lease of life. By about 3 days in, certainly by about 10 days in, they were hardly being used at all and have been used much more for maritime intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. Another key loitering munition. This is the Shahed 136 Iranian supplied thing. This is something which has been launched not in swarms. Swarms imply an intelligent relationship between the different weapons involved. They've been launched in groups against Ukrainian power targets and so on. You might say Mr. Zelensky there is a loitering munition, and a rather more powerful one, because he's not gone away, and he has really, he has won the information battle on behalf of the Ukrainians. But this Iranian drone, very simple, fundamentally, based upon cheap commercial microelectronics, the sort of GPS receiver you might have in your phone or other consumer devices. And that's one of the interesting things when you start taking apart even Russian equivalents of this kind of thing. You find an awful lot of Western parts and Western electronics inside them. What the loitering munition, the so-called kamikaze drone, does is simply, oops, sorry. Well, there was going. How do I go back? Well, we won't go back. It was just a film of something coming in and blowing something up, which we can do without. Of course, the other sort of drone that's been massively used in this war is this Jessops. You can go out and buy one yourself if you've got a spare 1,500 quid. And people have been donating these to the Ukrainians. Russians have been buying them for their own forces. And the Ukrainians were able to basically integrate these into their forces much earlier than the Russians. They've been used for reconnaissance and observation. They've been used to drop bombs and grenades and so on. Very, very simple, and in relative terms, very, very cheap. So countering drones is a key lesson of this war. We have to do a lot more to counter drones. And this is one way of countering drones. You can see the guy at the back. It's got a thing that looks like it's come out of an edition of Doctor Who. And essentially, it's a rifle which is firing some kind of electrical and magnetic pulses, and it overtakes the drone's command system and essentially makes it descend. Well, it can make it crash. It can make it descend to earth. you can use this, tried and tested, old-fashioned German Gepard anti-aircraft system, 2 cannons. These have been supplied by the Sorry? These have been supplied by the Germans to Ukraine. Some problems there because much of the ammunition comes from Switzerland, and the Swiss aren't too eager to supply. Drones again used, as I mentioned earlier, in the operation to sink the Moskva. Drones were used to distract the defences of the Moskva, to perhaps overwhelm the bridge and command crew with all sorts of different challenges to face, and the ship was taken out with Neptune anti-shipping missiles. You, of course, then have the unmanned equivalent at sea. Not so much a loitering munition, but certainly, I suppose, a kamikaze boat, if you insist on calling it that. One of these washed up back in September, and of course they were used for the attack on Sevastopol, which was again a joint unmanned boat operation involving unmanned drones as well. That may be a first. To have the 2 kinds of unmanned system in the same operation. And again, these are built by Ukraine, based upon commercial technology. The water jet engines from this come out of one of these. If water sports is your thing, 20,000 quid. I mean, they're not that expensive, but it's a Rotax engine, I think it's called, which is a easily obtained engine for sort of recreational vehicles and so on. So much more, another lesson clear then from this, much more needs to be done on air defence. And what this is an M-SHORAD. It's basically brand new American system, the first of which was deployed to Europe this year. And basically it has a cannon, it has, I think, Stinger missiles on this one. But what it will eventually have as things are improved, we don't yet know. But it's an example of the much more sophisticated kind of anti-air defences that are going to have to be deployed with armed forces in the future. But now, of course, another great lesson, which is not new, is that for all these wonder weapons of drones and javelins and so on, artillery fundamentally is what wins wars. And actually, the Russian attack on Kyiv at the start of the war was not defeated by the javelins and the NLAWs. They had an important role. It was defeated by artillery, massed artillery from the Ukrainian side. And what's become more and more important is the capacity to be able to strike with precision. This is an M777 gun supplied by the Americans. This has been described by somebody as the capacity to deliver a precision-guided airstrike from the back of a truck. Well, that's actually the multiple launch rocket system. But this is something that can fire with the right shell to a 4-meter circular error probability. So if you're launching it at a truck, you're going to hit within 4 meters of the truck, which is, there's not going to be much truck left. One crew already in Ukraine has fired about 6,000 shells from one of these. They've changed the barrels 4 times. So it just gives you a sense of the extraordinary. I mean, this is one of the greatest achievements of the Ukrainians, is actually managing the logistics of keeping, penny packets of a huge variety of different types of weapons in service. And that's quite fascinating. If you fire this out of it, the Excalibur round, which is GPS guided and so on, it can go out to about 40 kilometers, again, with a very, very high likelihood of hitting the target. One slight problem, each of these shells, I thought it was $112,000, but I looked up somewhere else and they suggested each one cost about $176,000. And the Americans have given quite a number of these to the Ukrainians, quite apart from many more ordinary high explosive shells. This is the other great precision-guided piece of rocket artillery, the HIMARS, very similar to the multiple launch rocket system, which the British Army deploys, which is essentially the same thing on a tracked vehicle. It can fire a whole variety of things. It's pretty much being used with the GMLRS at the moment on the left. And of course, there is a great debate those who say it should be given this ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which goes out to about 300 kilometers, and there are arguments about whether that should or should not be supplied to Ukraine. One of the systems that's crucially important to Ukraine is not a weapon at all. It's this, the awful Mr. Musk. It's Starlink. Starlink is essentially a satellite broadband system. If you live in a part of the world which doesn't have great broadband, you can sign up to Starlink and watch as many TV programs as you like. And essentially, it has thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. It's got at the moment about 3,000 odd satellites, with probably thousands more to be launched. Because it's in low Earth orbit, the latency, the speed is much better. And the deployment of this with the Ukrainians has been crucial. Essentially, it is a little dish like that, goes up to the satellite, comes down to a ground station. Where are the ground stations? Well, they're in places like Poland and I think Romania and Turkey and so on. And that has basically given the Ukrainians an extraordinary boost in terms of communications, both on the battlefield and more generally. Now, the other thing I mentioned to you, and we touched on it through looking at all these weapons, is industrial warfare. And, industrial scale warfare is back with a vengeance. And what we're seeing is extraordinary rates of attrition of equipment, extraordinary casualties. I think Mark Milley the other day suggested that both sides had had about 100,000 casualties, killed and wounded. It's quite disturbing numbers. And it raises huge questions as to whether Western industry can support large-scale warfare in the future. Ukraine is using up, let me just get the right statistic. The annual production of US shells would last about 10 days to 2 weeks in the fighting in Ukraine. Now, luckily, a lot of the systems that Ukraine is using from the West are NATO standard systems, and you can get ammunition from a number of countries. But you've got extraordinary things going on early in the war when the Ukrainians were running out of Soviet caliber ammunition for their own artillery. And there was, for example, during August, daily RAF-C-17 flights from Pakistan to Romania, carrying, we believe, Soviet caliber shells from Pakistan to Romania to then be passed on to the Ukrainians. And I mean, these figures on the left are not entirely accurate. It's from the Kiev Independent, which is a very nice, very good English language newspaper in Kiev. And some of the figures are not entirely right. And one of the reasons I'm keeping away from figures is, A, they're constantly changing and they're inherently unreliable. But I mean, you can see the differences there and the proportion of the British army that would be chewed up in this kind of warfare. If you think that the Russians have lost about 1,400 tanks so far, what is it? The Challenger 3, the upgraded British Challenger 3, which will be in service initially, if we're lucky, in 2027. I think they're actually upgrading 148 of them. I mean, you might argue it's hardly worth bothering. But it raises all sorts of questions. And I think General Mike Ryan, who's a noted Australian commentator, former general, now retired, he makes the point very, very well that, we are back to war as a battle of industrial systems. Well, get your books out on the Second World War. And if you are going to arm yourself with the prospect of being able to fight a war, which is, of course, crucial to deterrence, people have got to know that you are capable of prosecuting that war, then clearly we have got to shake up what we do industrially. And given the news today and the state our economy is in, heck, it's not an easy thing to do. The other problem, of course, we have, I don't know if any of you have followed the Ajax program, this armoured vehicle program for the British Army, which is at the moment simply giving people tinnitus and motion sickness and many people believe should simply just be cancelled. And it is the product of decades of failed studies and projects that have been, changed and transmogrified into another one. The days of going and developing your own system because the British Army's 150 vehicles have to be so special. No other army in the world needs a system like ours. Well, that's got to change. And the CDS, Chief of the Defence Staff, Tony Radakin, made this quite sensible point in his Lord Mayor's lecture back in October. And what does this mean? Well, it means maybe we should be a bit more like Poland. Poland needs multiple launch rocket systems, so it's buying 288 of these from South Korea. Fires NATO standard ammunition, no problem. It's the sort of the Kia equivalent, I suppose, or whatever. Poland is also buying 1,000 Korean battle tanks. It's buying 672 Korean self-propelled guns. It means that ultimately, qualitatively and quantitatively, Poland will be the most powerful European member of NATO. And you compare that with our 148 Challenger 3 tanks. It makes you wonder. And we've got a lot to do. I mean, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, pointing out that you're not going to get the regiments back and what have you. All of these enabling things, more artillery, more signals, more electronic warfare, more counter UAV. These are all the lessons initially that are being drawn from this conflict. Another very obvious corollary of industrial scale warfare is that there's no civilian sanctuary. Ukrainian cities are being hit. Terrible things have been done in occupied Ukrainian territory and so on. It's not. It's again back to the kind of warfare that we have not seen in Europe in our generation. It also means that you have economic warfare. I've often been asked on the radio, are we at war with Russia? Is NATO at war with Russia? Gracious, I mean, if it was the other way around, we might believe that we were at war with Russia, but we're certainly at economic war with Russia, both in terms of the sanctions leveled on Russia from the West, and of course, Russia's efforts to disrupt energy supplies going the other way. And I suppose, in a complicated world, this is what has happened since the start of the war. Russia's income has not been significantly damaged, though, of course, sanctions take time to have an effect. The Russian economy has also been impacted by large numbers of highly skilled people leaving because they don't want to be conscripted. It's been messed up by the conscription process itself. So the economies of countries that are in one sense or another engaged in this conflict are very much fair game. Now, I thought I'd just finish very quickly, sorry to sort of go through it so quickly, just finish very quickly with a sort of a what next, what happens next. And I mean, one general point about the war, we've talked a lot about things we can measure, although I've not been very good about giving statistics, but, you can measure numbers of weapons, you can measure miles on maps and so on. Clearly, what you can't measure is morale, commitment, sense of purpose, and so on. And there, Ukraine reminds us of an old lesson once again that motivation and morale are absolutely crucial. There are very few Russian soldiers, I believe, who understand what they are fighting for in Ukraine. And if they think they know what they're fighting for, once they actually get involved in close combat, they seem to be not so sure. And we've actually listened to transmissions of Russians talking about what's going on and so on. What's going to happen next? Well, Ukraine clearly has the initiative. We're heading for the winter. You've got the sort of muddy season at the moment. It's getting colder. And it's recaptured some 54% of the occupied territory. The Russians are still pushing very, very hard in Donetsk and clearly have redeployed some forces from Kherson in the south there. They've stepped up, as we've seen in recent days, the infrastructure and terror attacks. They are also running out of weaponry to some extent. But of course, they've had to go to North Korea for ammunition. They've gone to Iran for drones. One possibility is they could be getting ballistic missiles from Iran. that would be very serious, because they obviously have much larger warheads than many of the much smaller drones. The two sides, I think, have very contrasting winter goals. I mean, other than Donetsk, the Russians, I think, would like to consolidate, would like to calm things down over the winter, train up some of these many hopeless conscripts that they forced into the military. The Ukrainians would clearly like to carry on and retain and capitalize on their initiative. We just simply don't know how much ammunition and so on they have left. We don't know how many fully trained units, brigades they may have not yet committed to the battle. There's a lot of very loose talk about Zelensky. Sorry, I've really got it in for David Richards, haven't I? But I mean, he came out with an incredibly stupid statement yesterday. There's a lot of talk, the Ukrainians should be encouraged to make peace. Wars end by negotiation, not on the battlefield, so on and so forth. And he said words to the effect that we should no longer, we should stop subcontracting our security to Mr. Zelensky. Well, I mean, if the Ukrainians can destroy the Russian military capability, sounds like a very good idea to me. But of course, the reality is, of course, wars end with discussion. But the two sides need to be convinced that the time for discussion has come. And there's no likelihood of Russia at the moment stepping back. There is no likelihood of Mr. Zelensky accepting, certainly, that the territory occupied since February 24th or whatever it was is going to remain in Russian hands. Crimea is a problem in the longer term. There's no doubt about that. But, for now, nobody is talking too much about Crimea. So Zelensky has made out very clear his own sense of what the peace terms should be. Putin, of course, has really nailed his colours to the mast. I mean, I think the twin decisions, the mobilization directive and the decision to annex parts of occupied Ukraine, and indeed parts of unoccupied Ukraine, has been a real Rubicon for him, and changes he is now linked irrevocably with this campaign. And of course, as we've been touching on many times in this talk, there is the long haul industrial battle. Can Russia secure the microchips and the parts and so on that it needs to get output from its weapons factories? Can they overhaul and reconfigure older weaponry to re-equip forces in the field? Similarly, for the West, how far are our stocks of key weapon systems dwindling? I mean, remember, just as a closing thought, the Russian Air Force has not lost heavily in this war. It had some very intensive periods of activity and has to some extent sat out other phases of the war when it's still very much there. And if Ukraine were to run out of key surface-to-air weapons, particularly at mid-altitude, where the Russians did an awful lot of their work in Syria, the Russian Air Force could come into play again as a very potent force. So it ain't over. It's we're not even at half time, maybe, who knows, sadly, but the outcome isn't necessarily going to be a reflection of where we are now. I'm still optimistic, and I'm still fairly convinced that Ukraine will win through in the end, but it's going to depend upon a lot of external factors, and getting through the winter in countries like ours with no major energy disruptions and so on is also important. But, training up Ukrainians, getting the vital weapons to them in a timely and effective manner is going to remain crucial to the ability of Ukraine to conduct its warfighting operations in the future. And at that point, I think I shall hand back control to James.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Now, if you want to ask Jonathan any questions, please. Patrick, you got a question.
Yeah. I actually, excuse me, I wrote it down. Can you see it, Jamie, or shall I?
Oh, do please tell us, because I'm hopeless with my screen, and I've not got the sort of chat bit up.
Yeah, of course. Jonathan, very, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. We may disagree in quite a lot of your conclusions, but that'll become clear. I watched with interest as the operation developed in February, and I would agree. I mean, in my view, a boy was sent to do a man's job by Russia, and operations around Kiev failed badly. No question about that. What I couldn't understand is, and you, I don't know whether you alluded to it or failed to allude to it, but there was a stunningly successful operation carried out by the Russians, which established a land bridge from essentially Mariupol in the east right the way to Goliath in the west within days. There was not a great deal of fighting down there. There was some. I'm sure you're aware that the very substantial Ukrainian garrison on the north part of the Crimea, trying to block the Perikop up there, ran like rabbits. And yet nobody ever talks about that or gives the Russians the credit for a hugely successful operation, carried out, I might add, largely by gendarmes and local militia, not by Russian regulars.
Well, look, I think, it's certainly true that the Russian offensive in the south was much more successful. As I understand it, I think the Ukrainians made a lot of errors there in the way they approached the defense of the south. I also think that the Russians were massively more successful in the south in taking out air defenses and so on. I mean, I absolutely agree with you that they were more successful in the south. What they were prevented from doing, of course, was extending all the way across to Odessa. They were largely prevented by various means from mounting any major amphibious operation as part of that. And of course, the Moskva operation and others have served to, at the very least, push away the much more dominant Russian Navy away from the Ukrainian coast, which has been mined and so on and so forth. So look, I don't disagree with you. There they were effective. I mean, look, they took large swathes of the country, but Ukraine was not really, I think, in a position to simply prevent the Russians advancing on all fronts. What has become clear is when the Ukrainians do manage to gain the equipment and the organization and so on and so forth to mass their forces in particular places, they have had great success. And of course, what we've seen is this very patient campaign where they've used their advantages in precision strike, long-range artillery to make a mess of Russian logistics, to take out Russian command posts. I mean, huge numbers of Russian generals have been killed, to really make the Russians' lives quite impossible. And that has ultimately forced the Russians to give ground in Kherson and on that axis by putting them to flight effectively. In Kharkiv. In Kherson, rather differently, they were able to conduct a much more organized withdrawal. But of course, the fact remains they were forced to withdraw because logistically they could not sustain their troops on the western side of the Dnipro River. So I don't disagree with you. I just think that, this is a huge undertaking for the Ukrainians. I think they made mistakes in the south. Where they lost territory perhaps unnecessarily or through poor tactics and poor strategy. But no, I agree with you. But, overall, I don't think there's that much that the Russians can claim as a success here. I mean, pretty much on all fronts, they have been very unimpressive. And they've been unimpressive because they didn't embark on a militarized invasion. They thought they were going to lop off the head of the Ukrainian government, seize the capital very quickly, and deal with some, insurrection and rabble-rousers around the country for a few weeks, and the whole thing would be over. I mean, there was a fascinating picture. I saw you that map that the Belarus president had. Early on, I saw somebody put up a map of the Russian operation to invade Czechoslovakia. And drew the comparison that they were not so dissimilar. This idea of coming in from all axes, seizing the key centers of power, and basically saying to the population, well, I'm sorry, guys, it's all over. that's it. They didn't run this like a proper military operation. Their troops didn't know where they were going. Their logistical preparation was very poor. Their planning for air operations prior to the war was very poor. The Russians clearly are unable to mount the kind of, combined air operation that the Americans can, that we've seen, unfold in the Balkans and Iraq and Kuwait and so on. This is something the Russians simply do not have the capacity to do.
May I come back on that?
Yeah, of course.
Well, no, Jamie, I don't want to dominate this. I'm sure you've got lots of other big questions coming up.
No, far ahead, Patrick.
Okay, I absolutely agree. And I use the phrase again, that the Russians did not intend to, or did not attempt to carry out a conventional military operation. They intended to carry out a special military operation. They went in with very small numbers of troops, very small number, 180,000, gusting 200,000 at best. They operated in a way that they mixed their local militias with gendarmes and with just a few Russian regular artillerymen and certainly Russian regular pilots. And Jonathan, I take issue, if I may, you of all people know that modern campaigns are not just conducted on the land. And most, not all of your presentation, most has concentrated simply on territory and ground. I don't believe it's about that. If we ask ourselves, where is the Ukrainian Navy? Well, largely scuttled, certainly not at sea. Where is the Ukrainian Air Force? Shot out of the skies. How is Ukraine getting on the space warfare and the electronic element of this war? They're being trounced by Russia.
Well,
and my last point is, which capital in the next few months is going to be without power, without heat, without water, and may well have to be evacuated because of all those things which are lacking? And the answer is, it's not Moscow.
Well, I agree, Patrick, but I mean, trounced is not a word I would use to describe the balance of forces as things stand at the moment. I mean, the Russians have not performed well. This isn't just a sort of militia force with Rosguardia, gendarmes or whatever. I mean, remember, the Russian, Rosguardia is essentially the old Russian interior forces. And the interior forces in Russia range from riot control troops to their own kind of special forces. So you have a whole variety of capacities there. Now, you're right, there has been a mishmash of forces to some extent. You've got the separatists from the east, you've got the regular Russian army, you've got the Chechen fighters, you've got this whole sort of phenomenon of the Wagner mercenaries. And I mean, there are some very interesting things that could be said about the whole Russian command system. I mean, look, you're right to identify these things, but you're kind of blaming the Ukrainians for being the weaker party. I mean, they are the weaker party. The Russians should have taken over the place in 5 minutes. They didn't. Now, Ukraine, as you well know, has a very minimal navy. Even though it's got a very minimal navy, it has actually been, through other means, been able to sink the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. It's been able to avert an amphibious landing on its shores. It's been able to retake this crucial little island off the coast early on in the war. It's been able to attack Russia's main naval base in the region. Yes, none of these things are absolutely decisive in terms of winning the war, but in part of the wider sense, which is the information battle, showing that Ukraine can achieve something, showing that the Russians are not invulnerable, and so on and so forth. These are important. Now, the fact that Ukraine is not shelling Moscow or not rocketing Moscow, well, goodness me, I mean, that says, A, they can't, but I mean, B, that's a good thing. I mean, it's appalling that the Russians are attacking Ukrainian cities and have been attacking civilian targets with pretty much abandon throughout this conflict. I don't see that is a sign that you're right. It could have a terrible, devastating impact on Ukraine going forward. if the capital had to be evacuated. Obviously, huge numbers of Ukrainians are already displaced. But Ukraine is, a mobilized country in a way which Russia is not a mobilized country. It comes at a huge cost. The cost of the Ukrainian economy is massive. They're going to require, quite apart from all the weaponry everybody is giving them, they're going to require huge amounts of money from the European Union and others just to keep their economy afloat. But, these are just marks of their fundamentally weaker position. I'm not trying to suggest for a moment that we have a straight line from here to a sort of eventual Ukrainian victory and the Russians have to pack up and go home. But at the moment, they have demonstrated more than I think anybody would have imagined their capacity to take on and defeat the Russians. And there have been an awful lot. I mean, you stress the gendarmerie, as you call them, and so on. Well, there are an awful lot of real Russian troops involved in this war as well. And many of their better units, the airborne, the VDV, and some of the better Spetsnaz units and so on, have been chewed up appallingly by the Ukrainians. So, it is an interim verdict. The game, sadly, is underway. But I'm other than the South, probably, which I think you're right to highlight, I can't see too many successes. As far as the interesting point you mentioned, the electronic warfare, which was much more in evidence in some ways back in 2014 when the Russians were fighting. The electronic thing is being used a lot. But there was a very interesting report from the guys at RUSI who've been producing some really, really excellent stuff over the course of the war. They've been going out there and speaking to Ukrainian commanders and so on. And it seems that often a lot of the electronic warfare systems the Russians are using pose problems for the Russians themselves. And there was a marvelous example of a conversation between two Russian pilots, both of whose radar wasn't working. And when they spoke to their ground station, they found that actually the electronic warfare equipment on each of the aircraft was cancelling out the radar on the other, so they had to switch it off. The Russians are feeling their way, I think, still with a lot of this stuff. And they have the huge problem that there is so much commonality between the sorts of weapon systems they are employing. Radio traffic intelligence in the clear, a lot of it is in languages that they can all understand. So it makes these things, I think what is really going on in terms of electronic warfare is going to be really interesting. And I mean, the map I showed you of all the intelligence gathering aircraft swarming around the boundaries of this operation, we in the West are clearly picking up acres of material and intelligence that will be analysed, and we will in time get a much clearer sense of how far the electronic warfare equipment has been used. And it's a lot more, I'm sure, than we believe at the moment, but how effective it's actually been. And, you say I'm focusing on the ground. Well, I mean, I've talked a lot about different air systems, but, this is essentially a war for terror. I mean, Russia wants to annex Ukraine and eradicate Ukraine as a separate country. The Russian Air Force has been very active at certain parts of this war, less active in others. The Ukrainian Air Force has certainly had problems. It's much, much weaker again than the Russians. But, the Russians, what the Ukrainians have managed to do is to some extent negate the overwhelming advantage that Russia retains in air power, at least for the time being. And that, in a sense, is an achievement. I mean, we're here where, as I say, we're looking at the weak as opposed to the strong. So, I think that to be fair to the Ukrainians, they are, in many areas, they are doing better than one could ever have imagined, given their starting position.
Any more questions? Any more?
If I may.
Yeah.
Jonathan, a super, presentation by yourself. If with the West's continued support for President Zelensky, he manages to push back Putin time and time again until he's in a corner that Putin feels is the end for him. Do you think he will deploy tactical nuclear weapons or other nuclear?
Well, look, we've seen clearly, thank you, we've seen the threat both of nuclear weapons and of potential dirty bombs, or even the destruction of a nuclear reactor as prominent themes in Russia's information war. These things are clearly on their mind. I'm not sure what the practical benefit would be to Russia of using a tactical nuclear weapon. I mean, I'm not really of the generation that, where the Western forces were planning to use them to stem a Russian invasion westwards. But I understand that you'd have to use quite a lot of them if you wanted to get a very significant effect on the battlefield. If you just wanted to let one off as a kind of warning, and everybody would run around and suddenly come round to the way of thinking that Mr. Putin must be given an off-ramp or something, well, perhaps. But I think it's more complex than that, and in some ways more dangerous than that. I think because of the annexation decision and the mobilization, I think the position of Putin in his regime, I wouldn't say it's under question, but I think there is an element of vulnerability that didn't exist before this war. You're already seeing some alternative power centers. I wouldn't go too far, but I mean, this guy Prigozhin, who runs the Wagner outfit, he is very vocal. The Chechen leader is very vocal. You certainly hear from some of the richer people around the administration in Moscow unease at the way things are going. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily things are going to change tomorrow morning or necessarily anytime soon, but and you'd have to talk to a genuine Russia expert to unravel some of these things. There's a marvelous podcast, by the way, by Mark Galliotti, who looks at in Moscow's shadow, or something like that it's called, which is free. And he's a very noteworthy commentator on Russian affairs, and you can listen to that each week if you want to. But if you'd have said to me before this war started, might there be any question about Putin's long-term position, one would have said no. Certainly from what I read and people I speak to, they're not suggesting he's going to disappear tomorrow morning and there's going to be a military coup or whatever. But people are beginning to wonder, well, if this war ultimately ends in failure, is Putin going to be able to survive? It is a question. It's not that he won't survive, but it's a question. And, the Russian military is being battered. They have lost huge quantities of their most modern equipment. They've lost huge numbers of their best trained elite forces. These things matter. People respond to these things. The Russian military is held up to ridicule by the kind of nest of right-wing commentators who are, whispering in Putin's ear and monopolizing much of the media debate inside Russia itself. I mean, it's a point to underline that if there were to be a change in Russia, it's unlikely to be a change in a liberal direction. I mean, what we're seeing is, and this is largely instituted by Putin himself, the changes he's made, but what we are seeing is the emergence of a kind of Russian nationalist fab. The Economist called it fascism in a long article a few weeks back. But there is a strident nationalist, xenophobic mood on the right in Russia, which stems from Putin himself, which he's done a great deal to facilitate. And if there were to be an alternative, I think it might well be something, if you can imagine it, even more unpleasant than Mr. Putin himself. Whether people would put up with that ultimately in the long run, who knows?
Okay, thank you very much.
Phil's got a question. Phil, do you want to answer your question?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Many thanks, Jonathan, for a very interesting presentation. In the last couple of days, the recent long-range bombardment of the Ukraine, particularly the power station networks and all that kind of stuff, to me seemed incredibly counterintuitive and foolish to coincide with the summit, where there was kind of lots of world leaders sitting on the fence as to which way they would vote. What is your own actual analysis of that decision of Putin to do that at that moment in time?
I think he really doesn't care. I mean, I think what matters to Putin is the optics inside Russia itself. And every time there is what we would call a serious setback for the Russian forces on the ground, you see some kind of activity like this, which is championed in Russia as, as them bringing the Ukrainians to their knees and so on. I mean, I think they simply don't care. Remember, as far as Mr. Putin and his information machine is concerned, they are at war with NATO. That is their view. They have not invaded Ukraine. They are engaged in a preventive war against NATO's encroachment into their backyard, as they would see it. Now, the way this is seen in the rest of the world, I think, is interesting because, I mean, clearly in much of the, and again, this is another wider impact, the ramifications of the grain, the interruption of grain shipments, cooking oil and things like that, have a huge impact in many parts of the developing world. And of course, in much of the world, they don't see this war in quite the way we see it in the West. I mean, in the West, I'd sum it up if, most people are probably more worried about their mortgage repayments, but, in the West, the war is part of a wider problem, which is authoritarian regimes like Russia and China thinking that they can subvert the rules of the road or indeed establish new norms that suit them. And that is why Russia needs to be defeated in its invasion of Ukraine. Many people in the developing world see this as a war between developed countries in Europe. They may not think it's a great idea that Russia invaded, but they hear what the Russians say, and well, that could sound plausible too. And they're far more concerned about the wider ramifications, and they don't buy necessarily the Western position. A key country, of course, is China, which is kind of having it both ways. On the one hand, it kind of supports Russia. On the other hand, it's expressed its unease about nuclear matters, going back to the previous question, and so on in rather vague terms. The crucial thing, of course, is that it's not China that Russia is going to for weaponry, which would be a much better place to go if you were sitting in Moscow. They're having to go to North Korea and they're having to go to Iran because the Chinese are absolutely clear at this stage they are not going to risk breaking American sanctions. And indeed, I think, frankly, the Chinese are very happy to have a humbled Russia as their next door neighbor and their junior partner. I mean, I think having Russia as a junior partner fits in very nicely with President Xi's view of the future arrangements in the world. And, in a sense, this war, the Russians have kind of chosen China over any kind of relationship with the West. And who knows in the long term, but in the long term, I cannot see that as a particularly positive development for Russia.
Maybe that's answered the question, Phil.
Yeah, could I just briefly say then, does very interesting answer. Does that mean therefore that win or lose, Putin is not really concerned about being persona non grata for many years after the war has ended? And is that because he has essentially contempt for all those world leaders that were voting in recent days? Does he just not care about those and their future opinion for many years to come really at all?
Well, I don't think he cares about their opinion very much. I think he probably imagines that if the war were to end, I mean, look, if you view it from Moscow, they invaded, they seized Crimea. What happened? There were some sanctions. People said, tut, tut, blah, 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 blah. Life went on. Imagine if Ukraine had been taken over, if Zelensky had been assassinated, the upper echelons of the Ukrainian government had been wiped out in a couple of days, a bit of sporadic resistance had been quelled in a month or so, and Russia had taken over Ukraine, and that was it. What would the external reaction have been? We just don't know. I can't believe it would have been the kind of sanctions that would last for the next 30, 40 years. So I think, he set about this thinking that the outcome would be very different. He believes in his kind of fevered nationalist, xenophobic kind of worldview that this is Russia's destiny that is at stake here. He has contempt, I think, for most of the West. He regards the West as a set of people who have, it's a joke coming from him, who have no religious values, who promote homosexuality and peculiar sexual, I'm not saying it is peculiar, but, however, in his view, a whole load of peculiar sexual orientations, who are essentially decadent and what have you. And these are all themes of the Russian propaganda machine. So I don't think he really cares, and I don't think that he thinks that the long-term consequences of this war will necessarily last all that long. The question, of course, is how does it end? Will he himself still be in power? Who's going to pick up the bill for the reconstruction of Ukraine? What state are the Western economies and the global economy going to be after all of this? We simply don't know. But I don't think that Putin is motivated in any sense by a desire to have the respect of Western leaders and what have you. His narrative goes down quite well in parts of the developing world. He's developing an ever closer relationship, for example, with Iran, because it suits both of them. And they both have things they can benefit from. Having good relations with the West, not really a big issue for Putin, I think, at the current stage of things. He's basically written off the West as a set of people who simply want to humble Russia and see Russia trodden into the ground.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Jonathan, Nigel's got a question for you. Nigel? The question is, given Biden is now past midterm and a 50-50 chance the US will get a Trump government, how much Ukraine territory will the US concede to stop the shooting war?
Well, it's interesting. There was a speech last night by Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Austin, the US Defence Secretary. They were speaking after one of these regular meetings of NATO countries and other donors who are giving, this is coordinating arms supplies going to Ukraine. And this came after Milley last week appeared to suggest, we should take the winter to have a lull and start talking. And that caused some controversy. And both of them were very clear last night that they can't make decisions for the Ukrainians. It's up to Zelensky and the Ukrainians to decide when they want to talk. They support the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They're going to continue arming Ukraine as long as is necessary, etc., etc. So I think as far as this administration is concerned, there is no doubt. And I was rather disappointed by the BBC in the last couple of days. They, in the wake of the episode in Poland, they seem to be giving rather more credence, I think, than is necessary to the idea that the Europeans are beginning to get very cagey and what have you. There are differences in Europe, of course, as to how far they want Ukraine to be backed, how long the war should last, and so on. But, in reality, nobody can tell Zelensky to give half his country away to the Russians. I mean, it's just simply untenable. We've backed Ukraine because of the UN Charter and countries' right to self-defense and so on and so forth. We've nailed our colours to that mast. It would be madness, I think, to make any change now. There will be discussion when Putin believes that he isn't going to make any further headway and be able to hold on to significant swathes of territory. And at that point, that's the time to bring pressure on the Ukrainians to start talking. As far as a prospective Trump administration goes, God help us. A second Trump administration. One's got to hope that the outcome of the recent midterms and so on was marginally positive in terms of the Democratic side, marginally positive in terms of the damage that Trump, the poor performance of Trump-endorsed candidates and so on. So would Trump win next time? I just don't know. Biden is getting very, very old. Biden has done pretty well, actually, in my view. Economically, he's done well. He's been tough on things like Ukraine. What would Trump do on Ukraine? We just don't know. Remember the initial program of arming Ukraine. A lot of that came under a Trump administration. That was obviously the fighting was going on in the east of Ukraine. And, there was a perennial debate, should they supply them with Javelin missiles? They started supplying them with Javelin missiles under Trump. Trump, of course, rather likes people like Putin. He likes assertive authoritarian figures. We just don't know. I mean, there is a fringe of the Republican Party who don't like arming Ukraine and have been quite vocal on occasion. They're not the dominant strand at the moment. Well, at the moment, they're not in power, and they're certainly not the dominant strand anyway. But, 2 years is a long time to wait. I mean, if the war is going to carry on for another 2 years, goodness me, it's going to be pretty grim indeed. So I think things are set where they're set now. The initial thing is to get through the winter, for us to get through the winter with our power supply problems and what have you. And one assumes that Putin will do everything he can to make it worse as the weather gets colder. The Ukrainians have got to get through the winter, hopefully retain some kind of initiative on the ground, and we'll see. And of course, as we come out of the, often remember the war started in February. So as we come out of the winter and get into the end of January and start of February, presumably we're going to see, some significant movements again as the campaign gets underway. But, so far the Russians have been halted in the bits of the country. And I bow to Patrick's comments about the south, and he's quite right there. But, the Russians were halted in Kiev. They were pushed away in Kharkiv. They've been forced to retreat in Kherson. They haven't made huge progress recently in the east, even though they've been piling in pressure, and the casualties on both sides, I understand, have been horrendous. Can the Russians make something of this rather disparate force, particularly all of these very, very unwilling, unlikely people who've been dragooned into the military? I very much doubt it. I mean, it's not impossible in the future that parts of the Russian military could collapse. I'm not predicting that, but, under pressure, we've already seen in certain places the Russian military has collapsed. And precisely as Patrick mentioned, because many of the troops have not been, first line combat troops. So, we will see. But, this is, as I say, an interim verdict.
Can we have one more question? Has anybody else got a question for Jonathan? Okay, I've probably got one then. Jonathan, you're saying that there's huge casualties on both sides. Presumably the Russians can absorb the casualties far more than the Ukrainians. How long can the Ukrainians, do you think, sustain such large casualties?
Well, it's a huge problem. You're quite right. The positions of the two countries are very different. Ukraine is much smaller, but it is fully mobilized for this war in a way that Russia is not yet. And, Ukraine has huge number of troops under arms, in training and so on. And the training effort in Britain and elsewhere in Europe is providing some basic real military skill there. Albeit it's basic and it's limited, but it's much better than nothing. On the Russian side, the partial mobilization, whatever you want to call it, brought the war home to many Russians in ways that they hadn't realized before. 700,000 Russians left, or something ridiculous. I can't remember the exact number, but large numbers of young men left Russia. People in the high-tech industries and anybody who could get a job in Finland or Turkey or anywhere else left because they didn't want to be part of this. The casualties, the impact of the casualties in Russia. One thing we haven't mentioned, but the units that have been used and the way the Russian military is configured. An awful lot of the people. It's not the kids of middle-class people in St. Petersburg and Moscow who are being killed. It's people from the Muslim parts of the of Russia, or from backwaters and what have you. But nonetheless, over time, the message gets home that the casualties are very severe. So, yes, Russia has many, many more people. If the war's going to go on for 10 years, well, yes, gracious me. But I think that Russia is now having to, reach out and get people who it would never have expected to have had to be brought into military service. Many of them are not going to be very good. It's a moot point how much military capability these people will actually offer Russia. So it isn't just the fact that, they can keep on, sending people to be slaughtered and they just go back and get some more. Ultimately, this has some kind of impact back home in Russia too, and Putin has to be aware of the political optics of all of this. Ukraine is being given quite a lot of help with the treatment of people. People are going to all sorts of places, even some quite far away for advanced treatment. But at the end of the day, as I said in closing, it's morale. It's knowing why you're fighting. It's the Ukrainians are fighting for their country, and the Russians are fighting for Mr. Putin. I just can't see that there is a kind of long-term, history for this. The Russians, I think, are going to come up against a brick wall eventually, and having hundreds of thousands of poorly trained conscripts with out-of-date equipment is not going to do very much for them on the battlefield, and casualties have been immense. I mean, immense. Some units and even very good units absolutely decimated. And I've been looking at some websites which put up the obituary notices, and I mean, after all, these are the obituary notices that people see in Russia. And you look at particular units, naval infantry units, the VDV, the paratroop corps, and so on, and huge numbers of people have been lost. And often these sites, you only see the officers or the generals or whatever. If that's the casualties amongst them, then the casualties lower down. And you've only got to look at the amount of Russian equipment that has just been abandoned. It's either run out of fuel or they just don't like getting shelled, so they leg it. The number of Russian soldiers who surrender is quite significant. We don't have a number, but significant numbers have given up, and the Ukrainians have quite an impressive kind of propaganda effort to try and get Russians to come over and surrender. So it's grim. It's grim. There are going to be a lot more people killed, and it's going to be a very difficult winter for the Ukrainians. And there may well be a further outflow of refugees, as Patrick was alluding to. But we've come this far. We've backed them this far, and I can't actually see that changing. And I mean, finally, before the war, I mean, I'm a massive, James will know this, but I'm a massive compiler of cuttings and files and Christ knows what. And the amount of stuff before the war of divisions in Europe and nobody's going to support the Ukrainians, and there's a few bullish people like the Brits and everybody else is going to look the other way. It hasn't happened. I mean, it's quite remarkable. We can focus on the negative, but the positive, it's quite remarkable the level of assistance that has been given to Ukraine. And Putin could never have imagined in a million years that this would happen. And that is what has sustained them. And quite apart from their own morale and fighting spirit, clearly it's those supplies that have sustained them. And I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. The only question mark is in terms of stock levels, production levels. Can we get them the things that they need at the right time and so on?
Well, thank you, John.
I'm sorry, I sound a bit pro-Ukrainian, which
no. Well,
I suppose I am, but I mean, you can't think of too many wars. I mean, this is big power, industrial scale warfare. Your Czechoslovakia and the Germans march in. Well, this is Ukraine and the Russians have marched in. There's no rhyme or reason for it. It's just aggression pure and simple, because Mr. Putin believed he could get away with it.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one last question? With the West giving so much of its supplies to Ukraine in prosecuting, the war, special operation, what it is against Russia, is the West replenishing its own supplies for its own use at the same level as they're being dispensed to Ukraine?
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. You're quite right. And it's an important point. I mean, basically, supplying Ukraine would be a problem, let alone replacing everything that, you know, and remember, as I was trying to point out, we have to go to stocks which are much higher, vastly higher, certainly of ammunition and precision weapons, much higher stocks than we ever held in the past. I mean, I think most European countries have stocks for about a week of warfare. And that's not going to frighten anybody. So an awful lot of thought, I think, is going to have to be able. I mean, already you've got armament directors in Europe meeting and talking about how they will expand production. In America, there's talk of providing multi-year purchasing legislation. You know, nobody wants to open up a production line for this year if it's going to be cut next year. So, you know, 5 years, we want to reopen this production line. We're guaranteed to give you the money for the next 5 years. But there's going to have to be huge, huge effort put into that at a time when, look at the economy, we have no money. Similarly, you know, some weaponry, for example, I said the US Marine Corps gave up its M777s. They've probably gone to Ukraine. A lot of second order equipment has been given, like the Gepards from Germany, the anti-aircraft flak panzers, or whatever you want to call them. They're not used by the German army anymore, so they've gone to Ukraine. It's interesting that all of these European countries have stocks of redundant weaponry. I'm not too sure Britain has much stock of. Most of what's in service in Britain, I'm afraid, is a lot of it is pretty redundant. I mean, I have a friend in the army, and virtually everything they drive around in is older than him, which is you know, pretty extraordinary. So you put your finger on a huge problem economically to re-equip, to stock up at the scale. I mean, one option is obviously, as I said, to start buying things in common, to buy things off the shelf that are available. But that still requires money. It's a question of holding the necessary stocks, which again is expensive. I mean, as you well know, in any business, cutting back on stocks is a great way of saving money. And of course, in the commercial world, just in time is the mantra. You don't need to hold stocks. We'll have a distribution system that gets the right bit to the right place just in time. Well, just in time doesn't work quite that way in warfare. If you don't actually have the initial stocks in hand, you know. And for the military historians amongst you, shell crises. Think back to World War I. It's not a new phenomenon.
Yeah. Do you know, I came in a bit later on your presentation. Did you say the regimental system is being reinstituted into the British Army?
No. All I was saying is that when you talk about spending more money on defence, I mean, I haven't looked today to see whether anything at all was said on defence in the financial statement. But basically what the Defence Secretary was saying is, if we are going to invest more heavily, or if we are going to have to apportion our money differently, it won't be bringing back regiments that have been amalgamated or whatever. It will be buying things like artillery, electronic warfare systems, intelligence gathering systems, and so on.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. I'm going to give those the talk now. It's coming up to 7:45, and people have got to eat and one thing or another. All I can say to everybody is that Tim Crockett, who's the chairman of the Manchester History Group, is going to talk about Oliver Cromwell. Not next Thursday, the following Thursday. So if you're interested in that, do sign up. But thank you very much for all attending. And Jonathan, thank you very much for a most excellent talk.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, that was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
It's amazing. I mean, in a way, Patrick's trio of wonderful talks was a very good prelude to this. I mean, who would have thought we'd be obsessed with this part of the world again in quite the same way? But it's unfortunate, but what can you do? What can you do?
Okay.
Take good care.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Jonathan, you're going to have to close the meeting.
Am I? All right. What do I do to do that?
It says leave meeting or stop meeting.
Oh, does it? Oh, God. Back